Good evening, everyone. Okay, so for today, my name is Yuel. So, my video report for today is about poetic devices. Okay, so let's proceed. So, what are poetic devices? So, poetic devices are techniques and methods writers use to construct effective poems. Okay, so these poetic devices work on the levels of line by line, syntax, and rhythm, which make your poetry engaging and memorable. And they work on the deeper thematic level, which makes your poetry matter to the reader. Also, the poetic devices are the literary techniques that give your poetry shape, brightness, and contrast. Okay, so some of these poetic literary devices you probably already use instinctively. All poetry comes from a place within ourselves that recognize the power of story and song, and writers have formed these devices in poetry over time as a way for us to communicate with each other. Okay, so as you can see here in the picture, so effective poetic device are writer's secret weapon. Okay, now let's proceed to the 27 poetic devices used in poetry. Okay, so the first one is the alliteration. So harkening back to the days when poetry was mostly sung or read out loud, this literary device uses repeating opening sounds at the start of a series of successive words, giving them a lovely musical quality. Okay? Example of alliteration is the Wicked Witch of the West. Okay? So, also, the political power play and the false friends. Also, um, Cold cider is not an example of alliteration because even though the words begin with the same letter, they don't have the same sound. Okay? A sinking circus, on the other hand, kicks up each word with the same sound even though they look different on the page. Okay? The next kind of poetic devices is the allusion. Okay? So, allusion is where the poet makes an indirect reference to something outside of the poem, whether that's a real person, a well-known mythological cycle, or a struggle that's happening in the world we know. Okay, so sometimes this is simply to draw a parallel that the reader will easily understand, but often allusions are used to hint at something that it would be insensitive or even dangerous to directly acknowledge. So, example of allusion in Edgar Allan's Poe's The Raven, the bird in the question is described as perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. Okay, some of the poems, readers may recognize Pallas as a reference to Pallas Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom. This allusion shows that the narrator has a higher expect for learning. Okay, next um, a poetry device is the anaphora. Okay, so anaphora is the act of beginning a series of successive sentence or clauses, sentences, fragments with the same phrase. Okay, it's an older literary device that many writers instinctively still use today. Okay, knowing that it lends a unique emphasis and rhythm even if they don't know the specific term for it. You may have even use it for yourself without realizing it. Okay, so one of the examples of anaphora is the Charles Dickens A Tale of Two Cities. So it is one of the most famous uses of anaphora in English literature comes from Charles Dickens. Okay, so it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity, it was the reason of light, it was the reason of darkness. So it goes like this. For a while, and the audience falls into an only comfortable rhythm, but a sense of audience anticipation, they begin to anticipate the words as they come, giving them a feeling of singing along a song they never heard. The repetition of the beginning of each line also draws attention to the contrasting ideas that Dickens is introducing. So this can be particularly effective in a narrative poem or a poetic form that acts like a short story. Okay, understood? Now, the next poetic device is the assonance, also called vowel rhyme. Okay, so assonance is a poetic device that repeats vowel sounds in a word or phrase to create rhythm. Okay, we'll talk about rhythm a little more later on. Also called, I repeated it. So, go slow down, or example of assonance is go slow down the lonely road. Okay, so it is an example of well-balanced assonance. Okay, so we hear similar word sounds in the O and go and slow, and then later in lonely and road. So there's also a bit of clever I rhyme in the slow down. So don't the deep repetitive vowels just make you want to snuggle down onto them? So that's a question, probably. So you probably find yourself using repeating vowel sounds in your poetry already because the words just seem to naturally settle in together. Okay, so as you progress, you'll be able to see where those balanced vowels are beginning to shine through and then emphasizing them more. Okay. Next poetry device is the blank verse. Okay, blank verse is poetry that's written in a regular meter but with unrhymed line. It falls somewhere between formal and free verse poetry, while blank verse never has a formal rhyme scheme. Okay, so example of the blank verse is, okay, Morse of blank verse is written in iambic pentameter, which is popularized by Shakespeare in his plays. But soft, what light through yonder windows break. So that's the famous example of it. So it doesn't rhyme, but it follows the pattern of a 10-syllable line with alternating unstressed and stressed syllables. Okay, so try reading it out loud. So as you can see, some blank verses uses internal rhyme or words that rhyme within a line rather than at the end. Okay? So blank verse is a great way to add a poetic levity to writing that would otherwise read like prose. Okay? Now the next number 6 is the chiasmus. Okay, so a chiasmus is a word that brings to a mind the word chimera. Okay, coincidentally enough. Okay, so it is a stylish literary device that plays with the reversal of words or ideas. Okay, sometimes the words might be used together in a different way. So example of it is never let a fool kiss you, or kiss, or a kiss fool you. Okay, so or sometimes it may be the concepts of the idea that are presented in the fiction. Example of it is my heart burned with anguish and chilled was my body, and when I heard of his death, with heart and body as parallels, book ending the contrasting ideas of burned and chilled. Okay, so like anaphora, chiasmus can draw attention to contrasting idea and make a memorable impression of the leader. The next number is number 7. Okay, the word is consonance. So compared to assonance, consonance is the repetition of consonant sounds in a word or phrases. Okay, so repeated consonants can occur at the beginning, middle, or ending of a word. So you may recognize this as a form of classic children's tongue twister like Betty Butter bought some butter, but she said the butter's bitter. Okay? I don't know. The repeated B's and T's and a jig and real quality to the speech, as you can see. So you can also use this technique to add musicality and tone to the names of characters, such as a consonant sounds of holy Goliath, gentle L's, or the dread pirate Robert's guttural R's. Okay, so um, in poetry, repeating consonant sounds often cause the readers to stop and linger over the praise a little longer. Okay, so teasing out both its music and its meaning, notice the consonants in linger, little, longer, and music and meaning. So as you can see in the picture below, assonance, consonants, and alliteration are devices in poetry that creates rhythm with repeated sounds. Okay, let's move on. Next number is number 8, enjambment. So enjambment from a Middle French word meaning to step over. So, it is a poetic device in which thought or an idea in a poem carries over from one line to another without pause. Okay, or for example, April, okay, I mean, T.S. Eliot's, so The Wasteland says, April is the cruelest month, breathing lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire. So instead of ending his lines on the comma, where we would normally think to pause in our speech, he includes the verb in the line before moving into the next one. So this gives the poem a very different rhyme and complexity it otherwise would have had. Okay, so enjambment can also be used to create tension and surprise as the story you're telling through your poem twists and turn. Okay, understood? Now, the next uh, poetry device is the epistrophe. Okay, so unlike to anaphora, epistrophe is a literary device in which successive sentences or sentence fragments ends with the same praise. Okay, so our ears naturally attune to the landing point of any given word grouping, and so writers and speakers can use this tool to draw particular attention to word or idea. So one of the famous example of Abraham Lincoln's speech is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So we hear this word grouping the people landing 3 consecutive times. This same technique can be used in a still mode in your poem by landing on evocative words such as dark, gun, or again. Okay? Next, number 10 is imagery. So, imagery, one of the most important poetry devices, it's how you make the big ideas in your poem, as well as the poem's meaning, come alive for the reader. So, poets will make most of their limited space by using strong visual, auditory, olfactory, and even tactile sensations to give the reader a sense of time and place. It's popular in both poetry, prose, and fiction. So, example of it is the in Eliot's Prelude. He says, "The burnt out ends of smoky days, and now a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet." So this little excerpt is brimming with an intense vision of the scene that plays with all 5 of the senses. It makes us feel we're there. Okay. So next number is number 11, juxtaposition or juxtaposition. So juxtaposition is a contrast comparing dark with light, heroes with feelings. Okay, night with day, beauty with cruelty. So example of it is all fairs in love and war. So it is a famous example of juxtaposition. So the idea puts two normally conflicting concepts side by side to make us reconsider the relationship they have to each other. Okay, so just juxtaposition, I mean, is a literary device, can be light-hearted, such as friendship between a lion and a mouse, or it can give power and emotional resonance to a scene, such as soldiers leaving the green battle on a perfectly beautiful summer's day. Effective use of juxtaposition can change the tone of an entire poem. Okay, next word is the metaphor. Okay, um, metaphor is one of the most used poetic devices. Okay, so both in literature and in day-to-day speech, it presents one thing as another completely different thing, so as draw a powerful comparison of image. So one of example of metaphor is love is a battlefield. So it is a metaphor that equates a broad thematic idea, which is love, with something we all have at least a basic understanding of a battlefield. So it shows us that there are aspects in each that are also present in the other. So metaphors can also be implied when the poet uses a colorful image to suggest something about a character or an action. For instance, the article sparked a new conversation, giving the article a quality akin to a flame struck in the darkness. So rather than stating its literal meaning, a metaphor makes the meaning of the entire poem even stronger. So as you can see here in the picture below, so metaphors use non-literal meaning to communicate powerful truths. Okay, next word is the meter. So meter is the way in which rhythm is measured in a poem. So it's a pattern that functions on two basic premises: the number of syllables in a line of poetry and how each syllable is either stressed, given emphasis, such as the first syllable of nature, or unstressed. Okay, so one example of it is, yeah, the iambic pentameter, made famous by sonnet Shakespeare. Okay, so um, we express the type of meter the poem follows also in two parts. So the structure of stress and unstressed syllables and how many of them are in a single line. Okay, so uh, okay, as you can see, these are the many kinds of formal meter. Perhaps the most famous one thing is the, yes, I already said it, the iambic pentameter. Okay, next is the metonym. Okay, so metonym, similar to a metaphor. A metonym is a poetic device which uses an image or idea to stand in place or something. So this can be visual, such as in road signs or computer icons, where downwards arrow stands in place of the concept for download. So, or it can be a literary. So one of example to say is the White House is in discussion. So usually refers to a group of elected government officials rather than actual constructed house that has been painted white. Okay, so also one example is the mother tongue, and it is a native language, and the press is often used as a broad metonym for journalists. Some metonyms are no longer in use and can be worked into poems to show setting and context. For instance, okay, next word is the motif. So a motif is a symbol or idea that appears repeatedly to help support what the poet is trying to communicate. So in poetry, motifs are often things which we already have a cultural relationship. Bodies of water represent purity, sunrises to represent new beginnings, storm clouds to represent dramatic change. So when these ideas are used once in your poem, they are poetic devices called symbolism. To be a motif, they need to be used in repetition with each interval, creating stronger and stronger links between the themes of the poem and the reader's understanding of the word. Okay? Next word is the myth. Myths or legends are perhaps the greatest reservoir of creativity the poet has at their proposals. Okay? So through often use of interchangeably, myths are stories that tell of how something came to be. So, for example of it is the Noah's Ark. or the story behind the giant causeway in Ireland. So, legends are stories that blur the lines of the myth and story. For instance, the Greek heroes in the saga of Troy. So, it's worth looking to the stories from your own region and cultural background for inspiration. Contrary to what some might say, there's also nothing wrong with embracing the stories of other culture as long as they are done with reverence and respect. Okay, next one is the onomatopoeia. So, okay, so onomatopoeia are great poetic devices for adding rhythm and sensory presence to your word. So, onomatopoeia are words that, when spoken out loud, imitate sounds like what they're intended to mean. Okay, so example of it is buzzing. Okay? For instance, it's a verb that relates to the action of the traveling V. But spoken aloud, it sounds like the actual sound bees make, like murmuring, humming, and smacking. All sounds like the actions that they refer to in poetry. So you can have a lot of fun experimenting with onomatopoeia to make your reader feel like they're in the poem alongside you. Okay, number 18. Next is personification. Okay, so personification is a poetic device that gives a non-human entity, whether that's an animal, a plant, or cantac cantacus, dancing candlesticks, human characteristics, actions, and feelings. Sometimes this might be so extreme as to create an entirely human character with non-human shape. um, many Disney movies to follow this pattern. Okay, so one example of personification is the okay. Well, in poetry, we often the personification is more subtle. So the waves is stretching their white fingers up towards the sun, or shadows leering down accusingly, are both example of more subtle personification. So this fanciful image come from the narrator's relationship to the movement in time and their environment. Next word is the repetition. Okay, so repetition is used both as a poetic device and as an aspect of story structure, particularly when dealing with or by dealing in motifs. So in poetry, using the same word or phrase repeatedly allows the reader or listener to settle into a comfortable rhythm, offering them a sense of familiarity even they never heard that particular piece before. So it can also be used to bring seemingly unrelated lines, stanzas, back to the I mean uh, back to the same idea. So you can write poems with repeating words or phrases, or you can repeat broader ideas that you come back to again and again as the poem progresses. So as you can see in the picture below, anaphora, epistrophe, meter, and motif are all poetic devices that utilize repeating patterns. Okay. Next um, poetic device is the rhyme. So when most people think of rhyming words, they tend to think that's what's called perfect rhyme. So in which the final consonants, final vowels, and uh, the number um, the number of syllables in an ending word match completely. So these are an example of lines: table, fable, sound, ground, block, and blank. But there are many different kinds of rhymes. Other types include slant rhymes, in which some of the consonants or the vowels match, but not for all. For example, block and blank. Oh, so in internal rhymes, um, perfect rhymes that are used for rhythmic effect inside the line of poetry. For instance, double, toil and trouble, and I rhymes, words that look like they should rhyme only when read and not hard aloud, like date and temperate or love and move. So the rhyme scheme or pattern of rhyming lines a poem uses can have big impact on the poem's mood and language. Okay. Next word is the rhythm. Okay. So the true purpose of rhyme is to give your poetry a rhythm, which is the stage and the pattern a poem takes. What it comes down to is getting your words inside the reader's bones. So rhyme is one way to do this, and meter is another. So our line level poetic devices like assonance, consonance, and alliteration. So basically, the length of your lines and your style of language will also play a part. Quick short words and quick short lines of poetry gives the poem snappy feel, while longer, more indulgent lines will slow down the rhythm or the rhythm I mean. So the rhythm of the poem should match the story that it's telling. Okay, so it's a good idea to experiment with different kinds of rhythm in your poetry. Through many poets develop a comfortable rhythmic place in which their poetry feels most at home. Okay, the next word is the simile. Okay, or similes often get lumped together with the metaphors as poetic devices that express the similarities between two seemingly unrelated ideas. Okay, so they serve a very similar purpose in poetry but are approached slightly different, where a metaphor uses one idea to stand in place for another. A simile simply draws a comparison between these two things. So example of similes are the Shakespeare's her hair like golden threads play with her breath, and also one example is Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? So the word like in these examples is the hint that we're looking at a simile and not a metaphor. So using similes is a great way to impart sensory imagery and get your readers to think about something in a new way. Okay, next word is the symbolism. So we look at motifs earlier as recurring symbols in a poem. Not all symbolism is recurring, but all of it should support and the poet is trying to say as a large whole. So symbols in poetry might be sensory image, they might be metaphors for a real life issue, or they might be cultural icons which we already have deeply ingrained association. So example of it is a skull to represent death, a dove to represent peace, or the sun and the moon to represent masculine and feminine popularities. So by tapping into this pre-existing culture consciousness, the poet has an entirely new language with which to communicate. Okay. Next word is the synodoch, synodoch or synodoch. Okay, so synodoch is similar to a metonym in that it takes a small part of something to represent bigger, but rather than looking at something symbolically representative of a whole. So synodoch is a poetic device that looks at a physical part of the whole. To say, give me a hand means give me assistance, okay? Which may or may not involve an actual hand. Or all hands on the deck to mean all bodies, hands, and feet included. Okay, so it can sometimes be used in the opposite way to using a larger picture to represent a smaller part. So for example, to say New York is up to against Chicago probably doesn't refer to an actual civil war between two warring cities. Most likely you're just talking about smaller part of the whole, like the sports team. Okay, next word is timesis. Okay, so timesis, apart from being a word what that kind of looks like a sneeze, is another dialectal poetic device. It comes from a Greek word meaning to cut. Okay, so it involves cutting a word in half for emphasis. Sometimes this is colloquial, like absolutely or fun bloody tastic. Really, anytime an irate British person sticks bloody into a perfectly serviceable word. So it's also used in poetry and poetic prose to add emphasis to the idea. So example of it is the Romeo and Juliet. So Romeo says, "This is not Romeo. He's some other where," injecting other into somewhere for emphasis. So Temesis is a fun poetic device to play around with. So that allows you to be Jean looking at the words in a different way. All right. Next word is the tone. Okay, tone is not entirely quantifiable mood or atmosphere at your please. Some poets are great at crafting dark, haunting poetry. Other write poems full of sunshine that makes you think uh, of a languid summer morning in the grass. So you may find it different themes and messages require different moods, but very likely you'll find yourself settling into one signature atmosphere as you develop your poet's voice. Okay, so the best way to do this is to read poems of all different tones and styles to see which resonate best with you. You can also try making mood blanks of words to play around with in your poetry, either as list or as little bits of paper. Magnetic poetry, so example it words like night, silence, and howl conjure up one idea. Okay, other words is like Sunday, popcorn, and sparrow. It conjure up something very different. Okay. Last word is the zugma. So a zugma as well as being your new secret weapon in Scrabble. So is a poetic device that was used quite a lot in Old Greek poetry but isn't seen as much these days. So largely because it's difficult to do well, it's when a poet uses a word in one sentence to mean different things, often meaning a literal one and one meaning a figurative one. So example it is he lost his passport and his temper, or I left my heart and my favorite scarf in Santa Fe. So these are two instances where the verb is used in both literal and figurative ways. Okay? So how to use poetic devices? So seeing the range of word level tools available to you as a writer can be both exciting and a little overwhelming. As you can see, the 26 unassuming little letters of the English language carry within them a word of possibility. The poet just needs to know how to make them dance. Okay, so there are two ways to begin working with poetic devices. Both of them is essential. So the first is to read. So okay, so read classic poetry, modern poetry, free verse, blank verse, poetry written by men and women, all walks of life. So look at ways other artists have used these poetic devices effectively and see which moments in their works resonate with you and the most. Okay, then ask yourself why and what you can do to bring that light into your own poetry. So the second is to write. So the first is to read, the second is to write. The poet and novelist Margaret Atwood famously said, "You become a writer by writing." So there's no way. Um, reading poetry and reading about poetry is an important part of understanding technique, but the only real way to get these poetic devices in your bones and blood is to begin. So if you've started writing your own poetry already, go back and look at home of your earlier work. Can you spot any poetic device from this list? Okay, so I guess many of these literary devices work because they are resonate with our innate human instincts for rhythm and storytelling. You probably already use some of them without realizing it. See where you can pick out these little seeds and bring them to life even more. So as you progress, your awareness of technical literary device in poetry such as assonance, epistrophe, metonymy, and poetic form will become as natural as a musician who no longer needs to look at the keys. They simply form a part of your poet's voice. So as you can see in the picture below, there's a quote. The only true way to master literary devices in poetry is to try them out for yourself. Okay, so what are you waiting for? Just try it for yourself. Okay, so that's all for of my report today. Thank you so much.